In this lecture, you're going to learn how to build an API or an application programming interface for our Vidly application. With this API, other websites or mobile apps can work with our data. In practical terms, that means we're going to expose new endpoints that start with API, for example, API/movies. So other websites or mobile apps can send an HTTP request to this endpoint and get the list of our movies in JSON format. That is pure data. There is no HTML markup. So they can get the list of our movies and do whatever they want with it. Pretty much most of the popular websites that you're familiar with, like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Yelp, and so on, all these websites have APIs. So you can work with their data in your apps. This is the benefit of publishing APIs. Now, in this lecture, we're not going to look at consuming APIs. That's a different topic, but you're going to learn how to publish APIs so others can consume your APIs. Now, when it comes to building APIs in Django applications, there are basically two popular frameworks. One of them is Django TastyPie, which is currently at version 0.14. And surprisingly, it's beta, but it's been actively used in production on several websites. In fact, it's been around for a long time, since 2010. I have personally worked with it and I've been really happy. It has a very nice design, and that's the framework that I'm going to show you in this lecture. There is another framework that is called Django REST Framework, or DRF. This framework is a little bit more feature-rich, and you may want to use it in a large enterprise application. But compared to TastyPie, it's a little bit more complex to use. That's why in this lecture, I'm going to use TastyPie. So, back in VS Code, on the terminal, let's install Django-TastyPie. All right. Now we need to create a new app in this project. So Python manage.py start app, and we're going to call that app API. So this app is purely responsible for exposing API endpoints. Let's go ahead. Done. Now we need to register this in the list of install apps. So let's go to settings.py. Here somewhere we should have the installed apps. There you go. So we need to reference the config class in this app. That is api.apps.api config. Let's just quickly double check to make sure we got it right. So in the list of files, here's our API app. In this app, we have this apps module, and here's the name of the class that we need to reference, API config. Okay, so save the changes. Now, in this app, we're going to add a new model. So let's open up the models module. In the world of APIs, we refer to our models as resources. You might have heard the term RESTful API. REST stands for Representational State Transfer. It's a technical jargon for a bunch of conventions that define how applications should talk to each other over HTTP protocol. Now, in the REST world, we have these URLs. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator. So with this URL, we can locate the movies. Movie here is a resource. So essentially in the REST world, we're exposing some of our resources using URLs or Uniform Resource Locators. So back to the models module, we need to create a movie resource. So class movie resource. You could also call it movie, but it's better to add resource here to differentiate this from the movie model we have in the movies app. Because that movie class is part of our data model, we use that to get data from our database. But this is a movie resource, which is different from that. We use this to represent the concept of a movie in a RESTful API. You're going to see that shortly. So we should derive this class from the model resource class in Django TastyPie. So on the top, from TastyPie dot resources, we need to import the model resource class. And then add that here, model resource. Now, TastyPie looks for an inner class in this class called meta. So here we add another class, meta. This class defines some metadata about our movie resources. So there are a couple of attributes that we need to set here that TastyPie looks for. And by the way, you don't have to memorize any of these. You can always come back to TastyPie's documentation. So the first attribute is query set. And we need to set this to the query for getting the list of all movies. So on the top, from our movies app dot models module, we need to import the movie class. And here we're going to say movie.objects.all. Now this all method simply returns a query. It's not going to go in the database and get the list of all movies. It simply returns a query. This query will be executed at some point in the future. This is what we call lazy loading. So this query object is a lazy object. Now the second attribute that we need to set is resource underline name. And we set this to movies. And this determines what our endpoint will look like. So we use movies here, and that means later we'll have an API available at API/movies. Okay, so we're done with our models. The next step is to generate our URL endpoints. So let's go to our main Vidly app here and open up the URLs module. Currently, we have two URL patterns. Earlier, we told Django that any URLs that start with movies should be delegated to this module. We're going to take the same approach. So let's create another path and tell Django that any URLs that start with API/, we want to hand it off to a different module. What is that module? Well, here we need to import our movie resource model. So from API.models, let's import the movie resource model. Next, we need to create an instance of this class. So let's call that movie_resource. Now this object has a property called URLs. We don't see that here in IntelliSense, but this attribute returns the URLs for this movie resource based on the resource name that we set here. Okay, so let's delete line 21. Back to our include function. Here we pass movie resource dot URLs. Save the changes. That's all we had to do to create an API to expose our movie objects, or more accurately, movie resources. So to recap, we installed TastyPie. We created a new app called API. In that app, we added a new model that represents our movie resources. And finally, we registered a new URL pattern in urls.py. Now let's test our API. So back here, let's head over to API/movies. There you go. So all our movie objects are serialized as JSON. Here, in this JSON object, we have this property meta. This object has a few properties that is used for pagination. You can see currently we have a total of 2 movie objects in our database. Below that, we have this objects property, which is set to an array of movie objects. And here are our movie objects that we retrieved from the database. So more accurately, we refer to each of these objects as a movie resource. This is the public representation of a movie in our application. Now, currently, this public representation looks exactly like our movie model in the Movies app. So all the properties we had there also exist here. But this may not always be the case in a real-world application. For example, let's say in our API, we don't want to expose this property, date created. Let's say this is purely used internally by our application. So back to our API app, here in the meta class, we can set this attribute, exclude. We set it to a list, and in this list, we specify the properties or the fields that we want to exclude. In this case, date_created. Save the changes. Back here, let's refresh. Now that property is gone, beautiful. We also have this property, resource URI, that only exists in our movie resource objects. And this returns a URL that we can access to get more details about this movie. So that is set to /API/movies/1, where 1 is the ID of this movie. So if we head over to this address, we can see the properties of this movie object only. So in this lecture, we built a fully functional API with only a few lines of code.